right, Katie, today's lesson, class, today's lesson we're going to be looking at Truman's containment policy. So I have here, Katie, a container. And here, as you see in red,
a bandana.
Communism, of course. It's not a bandana, it's communism. So we're going to put that communism in a container, and then we close it, and what happens? Does it come out?
No.
Is it gone?
No.
Correct. It is not gone. It is still there. It is.
It's not spreading.
It is in a container. It is not spreading. It is contained. That is Truman's doctrine of containment. We're going to allow communism to stay where it is. It's in the container, but it's not going to spread. Right? We're going to leave it where it is, but we cannot allow it to spread. We've talked about this one already. This concept is based off of the idea that we understand Russia, that they are aggressive by nature, but if you stand up to them, they will back down. That's what our foreign policy experts are telling us in the 1940s, that if you stand up to Russia, they're going to be aggressive by nature. They're going to try stuff, but if you stand up to them, then they'll back down. So we need to contain communism. So our conversation today is going to be on how well does Truman do? How well is does his doctrine go? So we're going to see three things. Today we're going to do two of them. The first one, we're going to move ahead now to our lesson here. The first one is with Germany. And the Truman Doctrine is going to be first tested in 1948 in Germany. If you remember, we were talking about Yalta, the conference that split Germany into four sections. What were our four sections?
United States.
United States.
France.
France gets one, right? France.
England.
England. And
Russia.
Russia gets the fourth. And then we had Berlin separated also into four sections, and they were the same, right? United States, England, France, and Russia. And that is the city of Berlin, right? Well, in 1948, United States, England, and France decided that what we're going to do is we're going to create our three quadrants, three of the four quadrants here. We're going to join forces together and create West Germany. And also West Berlin. So we're going to connect all three of these. They got West Germany and West Berlin. Russia feels that that's not fair. You're ganging up on us. 3 against 1. So who's the leader of the Soviet Union?
Stalin.
Bang! Stalin, in 1948, decides to try to steal the city of West Berlin. He's going to set up the Russian tanks and blockade all access to roads leading from West Berlin into West Germany. So now, Truman has to make a decision. What do I do? Is this going against my containment policy? Is communism trying to spread?
Yeah.
Yes, where?
West.
Into West Berlin. So it's kind of leaking out here. It's trying to spread. So we got to contain it. Put it back in the container. So how does he do it? His first thought process, well, I could bomb the Russian tanks. But if you bomb the Russian tanks, what's Russia going to do?
Maybe go to war.
He's going to attack the United States, right? You're going to go to war. Do you want to go to war 3 years after World War II?
No.
No. Do the American people want to go to war 3 years after World War II? No. Right? So that's not an option. Option 2. Let it go. Don't say. Let it go. Let it no.
Stop.
Are you going to let it go? Go ahead. They can have it.
No.
No, right? Now, I just ran on this whole concept of we were going to have to stop the spread of communism. You can't just let it go. You can't. So now you got to come up with another option. So what does he come up with?
That
that, the Berlin airlift. And it's actually pretty clever what he is able to do. So what he does is he's going to have American planes fly over the Russian tanks and drop the supplies of food, medicines, clothing, anything that the West Berliners need. He's going to drop, several planes are going to drop supplies a day, and he does it for 321 days, almost a year, from 1948 to 49. He is dropping supplies to the people of West Berlin. Now, don't miss this concept too. It's amazing when you really think about it. These are the same planes that were bombing the Germans, right? The Americans were fighting against the Nazis. These same planes are now saving the people of West Berlin. And it is so convincing to a group of people that were worried that they were going to be treated as the spoils of war, that they were going to be treated as prisoners. No, the American people recognize them as the victims here, and they're trying to help. So we're dropping supplies. Easy way to remember: 3, 2, 1, drop them. Right, 321 days is a way to remember that. So, is it successful?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because Stalin now is kind of back in the corner. Because if now it's on Stalin, how can he stop it? The only way he can stop it is shoot down an American plane. If he shoots down an American plane, then he's starting World War III. Does he want World War III?
No.
No, right? He also just finished fighting World War II. So after 321 days, Truman wins the Berlin airlift. Stalin gives up. West Berlin is saved, and we stop the spread of communism. So we give Truman a big plus here. Good job, Truman, for doing this. I'm going to watch a quick clip here on the candy bomber. A very cool clip on someone who was one of the pilots here during this time.
Finally tonight, our person of the week. Whenever Americans get a warm reception in Berlin, whether it's President Kennedy, President Reagan, or presidential hopeful Barack Obama, they owe a debt of gratitude to an American pilot who started doing something 60 years ago this week that won the heart of that city in its darkest hour.
We had freedom, we had flour, they had to have both.
It was July 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was making a grab for Eastern Europe.
West Berlin, an island of freedom in the Red Sea, was in his way.
Berlin stood divided between East and West, so the Soviets cut off land supply lines to the 2.25 million West Berliners. The Allies decided on an airlift. American pilots began flying tons of flour, milk, meat, even coal to desperate Berliners. And 27-year-old Hal Halverson was one of those pilots. He noticed children standing behind barbed wire at the end of the runway. These are his own home movies.
And then I realized suddenly that not one of those 30 kids had put out their hand and said, "You got any chocolate?"
He gave the kids a stick of gum.
But these kids were so grateful, I had to do something.
Hal didn't ask anyone's permission. He then started fashioning tiny parachutes out of handkerchiefs and tied candy to each one. But he had to get the attention of the children on the ground below.
I'll wiggle the wings of that big airplane.
Those wing wiggles became Hal's trademark. He dropped dozens of tiny parachutes, and grateful German children spread the word about their former enemies, the Americans, and what they were doing.
They fell in love with America, and they went home and convinced their parents.
And the candy bar, that was a symbol of hope.
The military brass had no clue who the candy bomber was.
There in the base lot was a big stack of mail. And on the letters it said, "To Uncle Wiggly Wings."
But a reporter had seen Hal land and got his tail number. The candy bomber was about to get busted.
Thought it was going to be court-martialed.
He was called up before a colonel.
He said, "General Tanner thinks it's a good idea. Keep doing it and keep me informed."
Then other pilots joined in, and the candy bombing went on until the airlift ended in 1949. Americans from home were sending lots of candy and handkerchiefs.
the word came back also that I was a bachelor. And some of the handkerchiefs came black lace, perfumed. I got 3 wedding proposals.
All told, America's legions of candy bombers dropped about 250,000 tiny parachutes over Berlin and millions of pounds of candy.
Berlin we see today is in many ways a testament to what Hal Halvorson did. Berlin would not have been able to survive through that terrible winter of 1948 were it not for the spirit of the people of Berlin.
The healing balm in the wounds of war is what the airlift was, because they were so grateful, like the kids. The gratitude breaks down the walls between people when one's grateful.
And so we choose Hal
Isn't that
Halvorson.
cool? What a great story.
So nice.
Isn't it?
So cute.
So cute. All right, so our next story with this is in the Truman Doctrine. Let's see, what's our Billy Joel song?
Red
Harry
China.
Truman, Doris Day,
Red
Red
China.
China. Johnny Red, right. South Pacific, Walter Whitfield, Joe, Maggio, Joe McCarthy, Richard Dixon, too.
Okay,
All right.
okay.
All right, so China falls to communism. In 1949, China, as your president says, China is in a civil war between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. And you probably remember this, students from Non-Western World last year, the whole question of that. Mao is communist. Chiang is a nationalist. He's promoting capitalism. He's not the best guy, but he at least is promoting capitalism. So who are we supporting?
Chang.
We are supporting Chiang. We give Chiang, Truman gives Chiang $1 billion in 1948 and 49.
That's a lot of money.
Yes. Meanwhile, who do you think is going to step in and start supporting Mao?
Russia.
Russia, right. And they give Mao $1 billion over the next year. So both sides are getting about $1 billion. Mao uses that $1 billion to get the support of the Chinese people on his side. He's taking that money and giving it to people in need. Chiang, who is the person in charge, is using this money to build nice palaces and an elite living situation, living quarters. So Chiang is spending his money on himself. Mao is spending his money on the Chinese people. This Chinese people had been just destroyed from the Japanese over the years from the 1930s into 1940s with World War II. So they're looking for some peace finally, and they're dealing with this massive civil war. So who wins?
Mao.
Mao, right. So Mao wins, but what's interesting is the what happens next. Let's see here. Wrong one. Where is it? There. So looking at the map, China falls to communism.
Mm-hmm.
Chiang is able to escape though, and he goes to this little island of Taiwan. A little shout out to Amy Chen right now. A little island of Taiwan. And in Taiwan, we say that that is the rightful leader of China. And Truman says, remember Truman Doctrine, we got to contain communism. I don't recognize communist China. I don't see it. It doesn't exist. To Truman, this is China. There it is, right there, China. That's not China. Where? I don't see it. I almost picture him like getting scissors and cutting China out of his map. Like, what China? That's not China. China? China?
No. That's China.
That's China, right, according to the United States. You don't think it necessarily matters, but it does matter. What does China have? What did we listen to the other day?
Cool.
No. When I say United Nations, we have 5 countries have a...
Oh, I forget. Wait, I have it on this paper. Veto power.
A veto power. The veto power
I was
for the
paying
United
attention.
Nations. United States, England, France, Russia, and China. China, as your president said. China. But remember, this isn't China to us. That is China. Taiwan, that little island, that we consider China. So Russia is all mad because China just fell to communism. They're like, no, Mao should get the veto. And we're like, what are you talking about? No, he's not the rightful owner. Chiang is. So Chiang had the veto. Chiang keeps the veto. Russia storms out of the United Nations, and they're going to boycott. They're going to take the ball and go home. We're not going to go to any more United Nations meetings until you give the boycott or give the veto back to the rightful leaders of China. They say Mao. So that's important. That's going to be important later on. So we'll look for that. So the Truman Doctrine: success or failure in China?
Failure.
Failure, right? Here's a guy who ran for president. Vote for me because we got to make sure communism doesn't spread.
And it fell to China.
And
That's not
red China, as Billy Joel tells us, China falls to communism. So think about that for a second. Only you can stand up to Stalin. You're the best guy for communism. And the biggest country in the world the next year falls to communism by population. So we gave him a positive in Germany. We got to give him a big negative for China because he does not do well with China. Now, to give Truman credit, what else is he going to do? Do you want to go to war?
No.
No, right? 4 years now, 1949, he gave money, $1 billion to Chiang. We're not ready to fight, so he can't do that. What does the United States have? How did we end World War II? Oh, you could maybe...
We had the atomic bomb.
We could maybe threaten with the atomic bomb. Can you still do that?
No.
Why not?
Because.
Very innocent lives.
Of course, the innocent lives.
Yeah.
Russia has it.
Russia
as
has
well.
it too.
Hmm.
Oh, no. So the last piece of this, also in 1949, we can't use the scare tactics of the atomic bomb anymore because we're not the only ones that have it. Oh, no. The Rosenbergs here are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, worked for the Defense Department. And we assumed it would probably take about 10 years, so 1945, about 10 years, 1955, for the Russians to figure out the technology to build their own atomic bomb. It took them 4 because they got information from spies in the Defense Department. We find out this information through a man by the name of David Greenglass. Yes, that was his last name. Greenglass
That's
is
an
his
amazing
last name,
last name.
isn't it? David Greenglass gets caught. He's the carrier who's giving the information to the Russians. Well, he gets caught by federal agents, but he was just a carrier. He didn't work in the Defense Department. So they start questioning him, and he is only going to get 10 years in jail if he gives up who gave him the information. So he gives up who gave him the information, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. How did Greenglass know Julius and Ethel Rosenberg?
No idea.
He's Ethel's brother.
Who?
So he sold out his sister. Tommy, you would never do such a thing. Well, if she was spying, maybe you would.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
so
okay.
Greenglass.
Love you, bud.
That's nice. Greenglass gave up his sister. She is going to get the death penalty. She's going to be killed, as is Julius. And really, it was Julius that was doing it. There's no real question there. She knew about it. So the question is, does she deserve the death penalty too for knowing about it? She wasn't actually committing treason necessarily. Some would say she was, others would say, nah, well, she just knew about the treason, but she herself was not committing the treason. But yeah, Greenglass served 10 years in jail and he got out, but his sister and his brother-in-law were killed. Some question this trial in the midst of the hysteria of the Cold War, 1950s, communism. A Red Scare is starting to come up, and sadly, the fact that they were Jewish, there was a lot of people who were discriminating against them in the trial. People like to compare the 1920s to the 1950s. I'm going to put a little challenge on you right now, Katie. what court case in the 1920s do people compare this to? The court case that my class had a fun little activity where they read a play from my that I wrote, and we did it in class in the 1920s. What court case from the 1920s is this similar to? It was about a shoemaker who may have stole money in Massachusetts. And
Massachusetts versus.
no. In Massachusetts, the two men.
Sacco and Vanzetti.
There it is!
Oh
Hey! Sacco and Vanzetti. I'm sure my class
mom's
got
smart
this
and I'm
right.
not.
Alright, so we got two little minor stories left that I want to just tie in, and then we're going to be finished for today.
You're fired.
No, not that. We're going to do Korea tomorrow. Two other places, two small stories of Truman's presidency to finish up. Vietnam, which was controlled by the French during the war. Vietnam is once independence, but France is our friends. They want to control Vietnam. So Vietnam was controlled by Japan during World War II. Japan is now out. Vietnam is saying, hey, we want to be independent. France says, no, we want to control you. You're our colony. This man emerges. His name is Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh. Have I written down here? There's the Viet Minh. I'll write it down. Ho Chi Minh, Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is a Vietnamese leader who is asking Truman to support him in his independence over France. The only problem is, what kind of government does he want to set up?
A communist
He
government.
wants to set up a communist government. So the Truman Doctrine kicks in. I'm sorry, I cannot allow you to be a leader. I'm going to give money to France to fend off this rebellion. So he is leading a group called the Viet Minh, who are trying to create independence in Vietnam. But it's real small. The United States is not sending any troops. There's no Americans fighting. We are just giving money to France in their fight. And that's the beginning of this Vietnam conflict. But again, it's not a major story in Truman's presidency. We'll talk about that in the years to come. And then my last slide, just to recognize that Israel is created in 1948. Truman is the first president to recognize Israel's right to exist. This is finally a promise that was finally met after World War II. Makes a lot of sense, right? After the horrific nature of the Holocaust, many Jewish people feel like they don't have a place to go, that their own country created these death camps. Where are they going to go when the war is over? The British people, with the Balfour Declaration, with World War I, had promised Israel, the Jewish people, a country of Israel. This is called Zionism, that you would have, the Jewish people would have a homeland in Israel. So that promise from World War I was not honored. We are now going to recognize it after World War II. The United Nations will set up Israel in 1948 is in the Middle East. So, and Truman will recognize Israel's right to exist. And we'll definitely be talking about that in the years to come too. All right. So thank you for today. We will see, we have one positive, one negative. We got to tune in tomorrow for the Korean War to see what we give him a final score there on his handling of containment.